Um, I would say I like mythology. Yeah, I think that I do come to D&D from a different avenue than I think a lot of sort of big fans do. Usually when you talk to people about kind of what inspired them or what sort of brought them to Dungeons and Dragons, you hear stories about, medieval fantasy, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, things like that. And I liked those stories, but I didn't I come my way to D&D is a little bit more through board games. I grew up really liking, Indiana Jones and James Bond and Back to the Future. Like my inspirations for the game are a little bit different, but I like mythology. I like pulling from all sorts of places for my games, but I don't have the roots in some of it that I feel like some people do in this space. That was actually one of the reasons that when I started running for my first big group, I didn't even really necessarily want to homebrew my world. But when I realized that they had experience playing in the Forgotten Realms and Faerun and whatever you want to call it, right? The Sword Coast, 5th edition location, they knew all of this history about the D&D world that I didn't. So I realized I would have to sort of make my own, because it didn't feel right as the dungeon master, as the person running it, to know the least about everything. Yeah, so I think in a sense it definitely lends a different flavor maybe to some of how I approach sort of world building and what I think about. I just because I don't have that same initial leaning as I think a lot of folks do. Not to say I don't like it, but when we talk about like where do we go to find inspiration for the game, I feel a little bit like somebody zigging when everybody else is zagging. Like people talk about, Baldur's Gate 3 is great for inspiration, and Skyrim and Game of Thrones and all these things are great inspiration. And I like Outer Wilds was really great. Played that recently and loved it. Yeah, I guess I don't default to medieval fantasy necessarily for, I want to run a game that makes you feel kind of like you're in Twin Peaks at some point, whether that's more traditional fantasy setting or modern. Don't really care. I want to run a seafaring game at some point, but I kind of want it to feel like Star Trek, like you're a ship going from, interesting location to interesting location. So I think at the end of the day, the game feels like what it feels like, and everybody sort of imagines it a certain way. And if you come at it from a more traditional fantasy background, then that's what you picture. I don't think it's necessary though, and I don't think what I'm saying is groundbreaking. I think the game has already sort of evolved past all of those assumptions. Or at least that was my interpretation of that's how I see things so far. I've only been in the hobby for about 6 years now, so I'm relatively new. George, you also like Ghostbusters? Ghostbusters is one of my favorites too. It could just be I'm listing a bunch of awesome 80s and early 90s stuff, but it's awesome for a reason.